The contentious U.S. China trade relationship. Trade between the world's two biggest economies has ballooned in recent decades, bringing but also perils that have led to calls to rethink the relationship. For 30 years following the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, there was virtually no trade between the two countries. Washington had severed ties with the communist government in Beijing. In 1979, the United States and China normalized relations, prompting an explosion of trade over the next 4 decades from a few $1 billion worth to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. China also began a decades-long process of economic reform in the late 1970s under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. His government loosened state control over the economy and allowed private industry to develop. Chinese policymakers aimed to boost trade and investment, and in 1986 Beijing applied to rejoin the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the WTO's predecessor. After protracted negotiations with the United States and other WTO members, China joined the WTO in December 2001. As a condition of admission, Beijing committed to a sweeping set of economic reforms, including steep tariff cuts for imported goods, protections for intellectual property, IP, and transparency around its laws and regulations. Even before China joined the WTO, trade between the two countries was growing. But WTO membership ensured permanent normal trade relations, thereby providing U.S. and foreign companies additional certainty that they could produce in China and export to the United States. This leap in imports is due in part to China's critical position in global supply chains. Chinese factories assemble products for export to the United States using components from all over the world. U.S. consumers have benefited from lower prices, and U.S. companies have profited immensely from access to China's market. China is now the third largest export market for the United States, behind Canada and Mexico. A 2022 report by the U.S. China Business Council, an industry group, found that exports to China supported more than 1 million jobs in the United States. American companies earn hundreds of billions of dollars annually from sales in China, money they can then invest in their U.S. operations. Chinese companies have invested tens of billions of dollars in the United States, though this investment has dwindled in recent years amid heightened U.S. government scrutiny. For China, the gains from trade with the United States and the rest of the world have been tremendous. Since 2001, China's economy has grown more than 5-fold, adjusted for inflation, and it is now the world's second largest, behind only the United States. By some measures, it is the largest. Hundreds of millions of people have escaped extreme poverty as a result of this growth. Though the trade relationship has undoubtedly brought benefits, it has also presented the United States and other countries with a host of problems. Manufacturing job losses. Research led by economists David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson found that the costs of boosting trade with China, the so-called China shock, were more pronounced than those from increased trade with other countries, such as Japan. This was due to the speed at which imports rose, the vast size of China's low-wage workforce, and the range of affected industries. Their research shows that political polarization also increased in the areas of the country most harmed by competition with China, which some analysts say helped to spur the rise of Donald Trump and populist political forces. National security. U.S. policymakers are increasingly worried about Chinese efforts to acquire sensitive U.S. technology to achieve Beijing's industrial policy goals and bolster China's military. U.S. officials have repeatedly accused Beijing of stealing IP and requiring American companies to share their technologies as a condition of doing business in China, known as forced technology transfer. Wary of espionage, Washington has also raised concerns that U.S. companies that use Chinese technology could put U.S. national security at risk. Subsidization and state-owned enterprises. To achieve its economic goals, the Chinese government has poured subsidies into a range of industries with the aim of creating national champion companies. Some experts argue that these subsidies are wasteful, but they can be disruptive to other countries whose companies cannot compete against such levels of state support. The United States argues that many Chinese state-owned enterprises are effectively arms of the government and, unlike their private competitors, do not make decisions based on market forces. Currency manipulation. Many economists say China kept the value of its currency, the renminbi, artificially low in the decade after it joined the WTO by accumulating U.S. dollar reserves. A weaker currency makes Chinese imports cheaper and U.S. exports more expensive, thereby contributing to the United States' trade deficit with China. Labor and human rights violations. The United States has long been critical of China on human rights issues, and U.S. labor groups have persistently complained about poor working conditions in China. These concerns have resurfaced on the trade agenda in recent years with reports of forced labor in Xinjiang, where China is repressing millions of Uyghurs. The United States has attempted to address its trade concerns with China through a mixture of negotiation, disputes at the WTO, heightened investment scrutiny, tariffs, and its own industrial policy. The relationship has grown more combative over the past decade as U.S. policymakers have charted a progressively more assertive course. As part of China's entry into the WTO, U.S. negotiators demanded a temporary safeguard that could be used to limit imports from China, but this was hardly used before it expired 12 years later. Under President Biden, Washington has taken the most serious steps yet toward weakening China's play for economic dominance. He has retained some $360 billion worth of tariffs as well as many sanctions applied by Trump on Chinese individuals associated with human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, introduced unprecedented export controls that restrict Beijing's ability to obtain advanced technology, and banned some U.S. investment in sensitive technologies that lawmakers fear could be used to aid China's growing military. Meanwhile, several U.S. governors have signed laws preventing state pensions from investing in equities controlled by the Chinese state. Biden's willingness to continue economic escalation against China has raised questions about the future of the trade relationship. Neither U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, and retaliatory Chinese tariffs on U.S. exports, nor U.S. export controls has shown signs of being rolled back. To further escalate the trade conflict, U.S. policymakers could seek domestic means of countering China. Some legislators have introduced bills that would expand Biden's investment restrictions to include more Chinese industries. Other proposed legislation would require federal government investment plans to divest from Chinese companies, while pressure is mounting from some lawmakers to ban the social media giant TikTok, which is owned by Chinese company ByteDance. Henry Gao, a professor at Singapore Management University and an expert on Chinese law and international trade, says that the use of unilateral tariffs damages the United States' image as a champion of free trade and cedes moral authority to China. Hillman and Gao agree that it was a mistake for U.S. leaders to assume that WTO membership would fundamentally change China. I would take a step back and ask, was the WTO even designed to convert countries' economic systems? Gao says. My answer to that is no. Gao argues that China's model is unsustainable, and says that the United States should therefore be patient and work within the WTO, negotiating new rules as needed. If you try to compete with China by becoming China, what is the point even if you win in the end? Gao says. I would like to hear your perspective on the future of the trade relationship between the U.S. and China. Please share your thoughts by leaving a comment below this post.